The sun was lowering itself into the bruised sky of Dusty Hollow, spilling lavender and copper light across the rooftops and the long stretch of prairie beyond. Dust rose soft as breath over the road, stirred by a faint wind that smelled of horses and dry timber. In the corral outside town, Elijah Crow moved slowly, brushing down the flank of his bay mare, his hands moving with the kind of patience only sorrow teaches. His shoulders carried a weariness that no night of sleep could ease. The neighbors called him the ghost of Dusty Hollow, a man who walked and spoke but had long since buried his heart. Each evening he paused in his work to lift his eyes toward the cottonwood grove where his wife lay beneath a stone he carved with his own hands. That grave tethered him, his grief like a brand that never cooled. On the other side of town, inside a sagging farmhouse that smelled of kerosene and old anger, Clara Mae Dawson stood stiff, clutching the handle of a small carpetbag. She had packed it in a hurry. One dress, a Bible with frayed edges, and a scarf her grandmother had once given her. She thought she might beg her parents for mercy, but Harlan Dawson's face had turned to stone and Etta's voice carried the rasp of years that had withered into cruelty. They told her she was nothing but a burden, that her beauty tempted trouble, that she ate food better spent on her brothers. Their words landed with the sting of whips. "Out by sundown," her father said, his finger pointing toward the door like the barrel of a rifle. Her mother looked away, her silence colder than any insult. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped into the yard. The air felt too wide, too empty. A few neighbors lingered by their porches, whispering to one another. She caught fragments, "Dawson's girl cast out, not fit for a decent home, no dowry, no future." Each word clung to her like burrs. She kept her chin high though her eyes burned with unshed tears. Every step carried her farther from the only walls she had ever known and closer to the truth that she had been discarded like worn boots. She reached the edge of town as the sun slanted red across the earth. Her carpetbag grew heavier with each step until her knees buckled. She sank to the dust of the road, bonnet slipping, hands trembling against the ground. In that moment she felt the full weight of her aloneness, a girl of 20 stripped of family, name, and belonging. A shadow fell over her. Slow hoofbeats had carried a rider down the road, and now the figure halted, silent and still. Clara lifted her gaze and found herself staring into the lined face of Elijah Crow. His eyes were dark and steady, not searching for weakness, not prying into her shame, simply seeing her as she was. He said nothing. He swung down from the saddle with the careful motion of a man who had no hurry left in him. Dust puffed beneath his boots. He extended a hand, calloused, broad, unwavering. Clara hesitated, every nerve taut with fear of judgment. Yet she found no mockery in his gaze, only a quiet steadiness that beckoned like a lantern in a storm. Slowly she placed her trembling fingers into his palm. The strength of his grip surprised her, firm but gentle, lifting her from the dirt as though she weighed no more than a feather. Without a word, he took the carpetbag from her hand, slung it across his horse, and began walking beside her. She followed, her steps unsteady but guided by the certainty of his presence. They reached his cabin at the edge of town as twilight deepened, coyotes yipping faintly in the distance. The cabin was modest, rough logs darkened by years of sun and weather, but to Clara it looked like sanctuary. Elijah opened the door, lit a lamp, and motioned her inside. She stepped over the threshold, the air warm with the scent of wood smoke. A kettle murmured on the hearth. The place spoke of solitude but not neglect. Everything was in its place, worn yet tended. Elijah set bread and a tin cup of water before her. She ate slowly, the bread catching in her throat, aware of his gaze not fixed on her face but on her hands, as though urging them to steady. He sat across the table, silent, the lamplight carving shadows over his cheekbones. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to explain, but words tangled in her throat. So they sat in quiet, the fire popping softly, the silence between them not heavy but strangely comforting. Clara lay awake that night on a cot he pulled near the hearth. Her thoughts circled the cruelty of her parents, the humiliation of the townsfolk, and the unlooked-for kindness of a widower whose silence carried more comfort than pity. She listened to the steady breath of the man in the other room and felt, for the first time in hours, the knot in her chest ease. Morning brought the sharp eyes of Dusty Hollow. By the time Clara walked into town beside Elijah to fetch flour, Gossip had slithered through every porch and doorway. Murmurs followed them like rattlesnakes hidden in grass. Women whispered that she was nothing more than Dawson's cast-off. Men smirked that the widower had taken in a stray. Clara's face flushed hot, her body shrinking under their stares. Her hand tightened on the empty basket she carried, wishing she could disappear into the dust. But Elijah walked tall, his silence carrying the weight of defiance. When she faltered, he placed his hand lightly at her back, guiding her forward. That touch, steady as stone, spoke louder than words. It told every eye watching that she was under his shelter, that she was not alone. The market seemed to hush for a moment as they passed. Clara felt her spine straighten, her breath steadying with each step. When they returned to the cabin, she set the basket down and looked at him with eyes wet but steady. No words passed between them, yet gratitude throbbed in her chest, gratitude for a man who asked nothing, demanded nothing, only offered presence. She thought of the road where he found her, of his hand extended without question, and realized that perhaps being cast out had been the first step toward being seen. The prairie wind whispered against the walls of the cabin that night, carrying with it the faint sounds of distant coyotes and the creak of the trees. Clara sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, and for the first time since her parents' rejection she felt a fragile thread of belonging weave itself inside her chest. Elijah sat across the room, carving quietly at a piece of wood, his knife flashing in the firelight. Their silence was not emptiness, but a space where two battered souls could breathe without fear. In that quiet room, Clara understood she had not been abandoned to nothingness. She had been delivered into the presence of a man whose grief had carved him hollow yet left enough space to shelter another. And though she could not name the path ahead, she felt the stirrings of something steadier than hope, the sense that her story was not finished, that perhaps it had only just begun. The days unfolded in a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and strangely soothing, the air inside Elijah Crow's cabin thick with the scent of wood smoke and the quiet cadence of two souls learning how to move around each other. Clara rose with the dawn, her hands busy at the washbasin, her steps light across the floorboards that creaked under her weight. Elijah worked outside, splitting logs or tending to the animals, the sharp crack of his axe echoing across the open prairie. Their conversations were few, made up of nods and the occasional murmur, but in those silences a slow trust began to root itself like seedlings pressing through dry earth. Clara no longer trembled when she set the bread on the table before him, and Elijah no longer turned away so quickly when his eyes found hers across the lamplight. Yet the world beyond their cabin did not forget, nor forgive so easily. Dusty Hollow was a town that thrived on gossip the way cattle thrived on grass, and whispers about the widower and the Dawson girl spread with every passing day. When Clara ventured into town to fetch sewing needles or flour, heads turned, tongues wagged, and judgment filled the air thicker than summer heat. The cruelty was sharpest from her own parents, who carried themselves with smug disdain, declaring loudly that their daughter had been taken in by pity, that she was nothing more than a burden transferred from their shoulders to another man's. Their words seared her, reopening the wound of rejection until she feared she would bleed shame forever. Elijah bore these murmurs with a silence as steady as a canyon wall. When neighbors hinted that he should have chosen a different companion, when men muttered crude remarks in the saloon, he offered no reply. His stillness was not cowardice but a kind of quiet defiance, as though his very refusal to acknowledge their malice robbed it of its power. Yet Clara, young and bruised, could not always share his composure. One evening as they returned from town, her eyes wet with tears she tried to hide, she asked him why he had stopped for her on the road when he might have kept riding. Elijah paused, his expression unreadable in the fading light, and after a long silence his voice came low and rough as gravel. "Because I saw someone worth stopping for." Those words clung to her like a shield, fragile yet luminous, and for the first time she began to wonder if she truly might possess a worth beyond what her parents had scorned. The slow burn of dignity took root in her heart, though it was tested in the weeks that followed. Dusty Hollow's Sunday gathering at the small clapboard church became the crucible in which her courage was tried. Clara hesitated at the doorway, hymnal trembling in her hands, aware of every pair of eyes marking her presence. The Dawsons sat proudly in the front pew, their backs rigid, their whispers sharp as knives. When the congregation rose to sing, Clara's voice cracked, her throat tightening as if strangled by the memory of rejection. Murmurs swept the pews, subtle but piercing. "She doesn't belong." Poor Elijah, saddled with Dawson's shame. Her knees weakened, her breath shallow, and she felt the pull of flight pressing hard against her ribs. Then Elijah moved. He did not thunder or rage. He simply stepped forward, his frame tall against the stained glass, his voice quiet but unshakable. "You call her a burden," he said, his words carrying with the weight of stone dropping into still water. "I call her brave. You call her cast off. I call her found." A town can choose to tear down or to build up, but dignity does not come from kinfolk or gossip. It comes from the way a soul keeps standing when the world tries to grind it down. His speech was short, stripped of ornament, yet it fell into the room like a strike of lightning. The congregation stilled, the murmurs died, and even Harlan Dawson's jaw tightened with a silence he could not break. Clara, heart hammering, lifted her chin. Something within her cracked open. Not the wound of shame, but the chamber where strength had been waiting all along. She raised her voice once more to join the hymn, and this time it did not falter. Her notes carried, fragile yet steady, threading through the room until even the most skeptical listener felt the tremor of her courage. When the hymn ended, the hush that followed was not filled with scorn but with something heavier, something like respect. The transformation did not happen in a single day, but after that Sunday the town's eyes softened. Not all hearts changed, but enough that Clara could walk down Main Street without shrinking into herself. Some nodded to her as she passed, others offered small smiles. They no longer saw merely Dawson's discarded daughter. They began to see a young woman who had faced humiliation and stood taller for it. At the cabin that evening, Clara knelt beside the grave beneath the cottonwoods, her hands resting on the stone Elijah had carved. She laid wildflowers there, their colors bright against the weathered earth. "Thank you," she whispered softly, though she did not know whether she spoke to the woman buried beneath or to the silent widower standing behind her. "Thank you for lending me his strength." Elijah's eyes lingered on her, and for the first time in years he felt the knot of grief loosen, the unbearable weight shifting into something gentler. When Clara rose, the sunset stretched wide across the prairie, a wash of gold and crimson that seemed to set the horizon aflame. Elijah extended his arm, not commanding, not claiming, but offering. Clara placed her hand upon it, steady now, no longer the girl who had collapsed on the road but a woman walking into her own future. They stood together in the glow of the dying day, not yet lovers, but companions bound by quiet acts of grace. As the first stars pricked the sky, the cabin behind them glowed faint with firelight, a beacon against the vast emptiness of the plains. Clara felt the stirrings of belonging take deeper root, while Elijah, once a ghost among the living, found that he no longer walked alone. Their bond was forged not in declarations but in silence, in resilience, in the small mercies that speak louder than any oath. And if Dusty Hollow still whispered, if shadows of judgment lingered, they no longer held power. For two wounded souls had found a way to stand together, steady as stone, gentle as the evening wind. And though the road ahead stretched long and uncertain, it promised not despair but possibility, the kind of frontier that lives not in the land but in the heart.